Welcome back, listeners, to a brand new episode of The New Standard. And as always, the show is hosted by yours truly, Lance Williams. And I want to apologize for not coming out with a show recently, but there's not a lot going on in Steeler Nation. So I personally think I would rather give you a show of real material. And also, I think right now, uh, without anything going on, I think it's an excellent time to dig into the roster and take a look at some other questions that I think might be warranted of discussing and thinking about this team, the Pittsburgh Steelers. And before we jump into that, though, let me give you the information to participate in the show. And I want to thank everybody who participated in the show and wished me a happy 54th birthday. I want to thank everybody out there for that. Um, and so if you want to participate in the show, go to YouTube, do a search for the New Standard, and also do a search for the New Standard and Steelers and or Lance Williams and Neil Coulong. The show will also be up via podcast very shortly. And tomorrow, we'll be having a show with Ian Whetstone of SteelCityInsider.com breaking down uh, the ramifications of a Cam Hayward extension, should the Steelers do it, what it might look like financially, so on and so forth. But I want to jump into today's show. And the title of today's show is One and a Possible. And if you play spades, if you play bid whist, you play spades, you understand what I'm talking about when I say one and a possible. And that's when you're bidding. One is a guaranteed one, but in this sense, it'll be wide receiver, the position group wide receiver. And a possible will be, do the Steelers have a number two? I think the big question, one of the biggest questions going into the offseason and talking about the Steelers offense is, do they have a number two wide receiver? But I think in terms of looking at that question, I think it popped up another question to me is, do they have a number one wide receiver? I think all of Steeler Nation presumably thinks that it's George Pickins, but I want to take a look at that. And that's why I named the show One and a Possible, because the one thing I think that can mitigate a new coordinator, new quarterback, mitigate some of those issues if you have dynamic and explosive playmakers. If you have guys on your roster that can literally turn shit into shinola. If you have those type of guys on your roster, a lot of times that can mitigate, again, new scheme, new coordinator, new quarterback, and those issues, because you have playmakers that can just make plays. And I wanted to take a step back. Again, you're checking out the New Standard. The name of the show is One and a Possible, and you're checking out the program on June 23rd, 2024. And I wanted to take a look at playoff teams and their number one and number two options. Now, you may disagree. I kind of base the number one option based on targets, kind of their reputation around the league, so on and so forth. Now, when you look at the number one targets in the AFC last year, and I'm gonna list it based on the seeds from the Ravens down to the Steelers. I think the Ravens' number one wide receiver or number one receiving threat, let me just say it that way, was Mark Andrews. Finished with 45 receptions on 61 targets, 554 yards, averaged 12.1 yards per catch, averaged a catch percentage of 74%. The Bills, it was Stephon Diggs, targeted 160 times, 107 catches for 1,183 yards. Travis Kelce, Nico Collins, Amari Cooper, Tyreek Hill. And for the purposes of the Steelers, I listed George Pickens as their number one because, in comparison to Deontay Johnson, He had 106 targets to Deontay Johnson's 87. Now, some of you may disagree. The other thing is when you look at Tyreek Hill, he got 119 catches. Amari Cooper, 128 targets, 72 catches. Nico Collins, 109 targets, 80 catches. Travis Kelce, 120 targets, 93 catches. Stephon Diggs, 160 targets, 107 catches. You look at all those players, their catch percentage was 74%, 67%, 77%, 73%. Amari Cooper's was the lowest at 56%. Tyreek Hill had a 70% catch percentage, and George Pickens had a 59% catch percentage. Now, I think it's very important to determine how do you define a number one receiver. For me, you have to pass the eye test. You have to pass the sound test, and you have to pass the production test. The eye test is simply when you turn on the TV, you turn on the film, you look at these guys play, do they look like number ones? You can argue that there's no doubt that any of those guys that I named that they don't look like number ones. These guys look like guys. They look like horses. I mean, Mark Andrews, Kelsey, two of the best tight ends. Stephon Diggs, although he got moved to the Texans, put in work the last several years. Nico Collins just got paid. Amari Cooper been getting paid. Tyreek Hill, well, the cheetah is the cheetah. We know the cheetah is the number one. The thing about it, when you look at these number ones, first, the eye test. Secondly, the sound test. When I say Mark Andrews, Stephon Diggs, Travis Kelce, Nico Collins, Amari Cooper, Tyreek Hill, George Pickens, do they sound like number ones? Do they sound like, when I say that name to you, does it, in your head, does it resonate and you say that that's a number one wide receiver? And the last thing is the production test. And the one thing you see with number one wide receiving targets is they get absolutely spammed. Stephon Diggs, 160. Travis Kelce, 121. Nico Collins, 109. Amari Cooper, 128. Tyreek Hill, 171. Even George Pickens had 106 targets. The average targets for these guys, and I wanted to emphasize playoff teams because it's just no need looking at, say, a team Carolina. And I know they didn't have an individual like this, but who would care if Carolina had a guy that got 200 targets, but they won 3 games? Nobody cares about that. So I want to keep this in context of very good teams. The average targets for number ones for playoff teams in the AFC was 122. In the NFC, it was even more than that, 143. You had CeeDee Lamb getting targeted 181 times. Amon-Ra St. Brown getting targeted 164. Mike Evans, 136. A.J. Brown, 158. Puka Nacua, 160. These are high volume guys. Brandon Aiyuk, 105. And the average yards for number one receivers in the AFC was 1,171. Their average yards per catch was 14. In the NFC, it was just bonkers. The average yards per catch was 14, but the yards was 1,371. I mean, these guys are getting major targets. So when you think of a number one wide receiver, they have to be a guy that you would give a ton of volume to. Now, the reason why I'm calling this one in a possible, and again, you're checking out the new standard hosted by yours truly, Lance Williams. Make sure you check out the show with Ian Whetstone tomorrow, where we break down everything Cam Hayward in terms of his extension. The one thing also, when you look at these guys, is they have very high catch percentages. I mean, Mark Andrews, just keeping it on the AFC, Mark Andrews, 74%. Stephon Diggs, 67%. Travis Kelce, 77%. Now, the tight ends are going to be a little bit higher because they don't run The route combinations that they run or the route tree that they run is not as long. Amari Cooper was very low at 56%, Tariq Hill 70%, and George Pickens 59%. And the reason I'm calling this one in a possible, it's kind of a combination of the two. Is George Pickens a one? That's why I'm calling it one in a possible. And I'm also calling the show one in a possible is because do the Steelers have a number two? Now let's go back to the number one. I think George Pickens, when you look at him for the eye test, physically, he checks off all the boxes. I mean, he is the prototypical X receiver. And I think where he becomes extra freaky is because he's a long strider, big athlete. But along with that, it's his ability, his run after the catch, and his ability to high point the football. It's just outstanding. I mean, he can do things with his body control in the air, high pointing the football, run after catch, his speed, his explosion. I mean, when you average 18.1 yards per catch, you're special. Where George Pickens has to improve when you look at the numbers is catch percentage. And think about it in your head, Steeler fans, as you listen to this. Can you spam George Pickens, let's say 150 times? Can you give George Pickens 150 targets? Can you give him 164 like Amon St. Brown, 160 like Puka Nacua, 158 like A.J. Brown? That's where the one and the possible comes into play. Can he be a guy that you spam to that level where he is the number one receiving engine of your offense? It's yet to be determined, but I think he can. I think you can spam George Pickens. I think the Steelers should spam George Pickens. I think George Pickens is a guy that needs to get 10 plus targets a game. That George Pickens is a guy that should get at least 150 targets plus in a season. Now, that may result in his yards per catch coming down, but he's the number one threat, receiving threat on the Steelers. And I think one in a possible in terms of he is not a number one right now, but I think he scratches all the physical boxes to be a number one, and he can be a number one in the right system. Spam George Pickens 150, 160 targets. You'll see him probably have 1,600 yards if a quarterback is having a really good season. I think the biggest question in looking at the Steeler offense is, do they have a number two receiver? And in looking at Deontay Johnson, who can be better than Deontay Johnson, one who had 51, and maybe not receiver, maybe just receiving option. When you look at Deontay Johnson's numbers from last year, 51 receptions on 87 targets, 717 yards, average 14.1 yards per catch. Now, if you look at his numbers and you compare them across other guys that I considered number two wide receivers, that was Zay Flowers, Dalton Kincaid, Rashee Rice, Dalton Schultz, David Njoku, Jalen Waddle, and Deontay Johnson. And my preference would be that the Steelers' number two receiving option is a wide receiver, and their third receiving option is a tight end. Some of these guys on this list, and Dalton Schultz, Dalton Kincaid, David Njoku, these guys are tight end. But still, when you look at David Njoku, I mean, the guy had 123 targets. I mean, can the Steelers find a number two option? And the average number of targets for the number two option on the playoff teams in the AFC was 100, and it was 101 for NFC teams. Is there another person on that roster that warrants getting that volume of targets? Could it be Pat Freiermuth? Right now, I don't think they have a wide receiver on the roster to warrant those number of targets. They just don't. I think that player has to emerge. Either you go out and get that player, Brandon Aiyuk, and it's interesting if you brought in Brandon Aiyuk, who would be your number one? Would it be Brandon Aiyuk or George Pickins? Because arguably Brandon Aiyuk, in my opinion, was the number one wide receiver for the San Francisco 49ers the last 2 years. I mean, you look at Brandon Ayuk's numbers, 75 catches on 105 targets for 1,342 yards, average 17.9 yards a catch. That is $30 million a year money. That's big number one money. But it still would be an interesting argument. And the Steelers' offense undoubtedly would be immeasurably better if you brought Brandon Aiyuk into the fold. Again, listeners, you're checking out the new standard on June 23rd, 2024. Make sure you check us out tomorrow when we do our interview with Ian Whetstone of Steel City Insider as we break down everything Cam Hayward in regards to if he should or will he get an extension. So I think when you look at number twos, even in the NFC, you look at average catches, 72, 101, 882. That's what the number two got. In the AFC, it was 70 receptions, 100 targets, 817. Is Freiermuth a guy that warrants 100 plus targets? Do they have a receiver on their team that warrants 100 plus targets outside of George Pickens? I think that is the major question that the Steelers have to answer in terms of their offense going into one of the major things into the 2024 season. Right now, I think they have a hole in the roster. I don't think they have a number two wide receiver that would warrant 100 targets. Right now, definitely not a wide receiver. And I don't know if you could argue that Pat Freiermuth should get 100 targets either. I mean, I think they have to bring in another player to get those targets. I mean, if you look at 2022, you look at the AFC, the number two receiver averaged 68 receptions, 103 targets, averaged 13 yards a catch, 900 yards. In the NFC, it was 73 catches, 103 targets, 821. You look at a guy like a Zay Jones a couple years ago as a number two, 82 catches, 121. Jalen Waddle, 75 catches on 117 targets for about 1,400. Juju Smith-Schuster for the Chiefs. And again, these are playoff teams, 78 receptions, 101 targets. The Steelers would love to find, now that they don't have Deontay Johnson, a guy to give you 78 on 101 targets, 933 yards, average 12 yards a catch. They've got to find that person somewhere on their roster. Now, they might not find a number two as good as a Devontae Johnson. I mean, those guys just aren't out there. A Chris Godwin. But somehow those volume of targets have to go somewhere. You don't want those 130 targets that Chris Godwin got last year to go to the running game. It just can't work that way. Those 130 targets have to be spread out at least between the top three passing options. Now, you can pass off some of those, let's say 130 options. You could give some of those to George Pickens. You could give George Pickens, maybe 50 of those to get them to 160, 54 of those to get them to 160. Still got another 80. You still got another 80 targets. So who's going to get those targets? And that's why, as much as anything, the targets are very important as well. How do you redistribute that across your roster when you're trying to fill out the hole of the number two wide receiver? So those are some of the things I'm thinking about when I'm thinking about the Pittsburgh Steelers in this offseason. And now that it's just a very down offseason, we're going to bring more of those type questions. So when you listen to the show, please, in the chat, list some theoretical questions and some deeper questions that you want me to tackle from a perspective of my opinion and looking out at some metrics to try to break this stuff down. But again, tomorrow, make sure you check out the new standard with Ian Whetstone as we break down the Cam Hayward possible extension moving forward and what that looks like and should that happen. But with that, we're going to conclude the program. And as always, tune in, tell a friend, and subscribe.